welcome everybody to this evening's Waterway and Catchment Report Card Share the Science event. It's so great to have you all with us. Thank you. My name is Erin Masters and I'm an Environmental Officer with Water Quality and Education with Midcoast Council. So we're really here tonight to talk about our waterways. The Midcoast waterways are really one of the most important parts of our landscape. They're important to everybody that lives here, and in fact, they're the reason why a lot of us choose to live here. And healthy waterways are so important to us. They keep our communities thriving. They're important for our wildlife and for just everything that lives in this region. And so to achieve the best outcomes that we can for our waterways, we rely on a variety of research, monitoring, modelling, and local knowledge to help manage our waterways and keep them as healthy as possible. And tonight we're going to talk about a couple of different things. So for those of you who have joined us for some of our other sessions, we will just talk a little bit about our annual waterway and catchment report card this evening. So this is an annual report card that we do each year, and I'll just quickly take you through some of the results from that. And then we'll be talking about some of the different research that we're undertaking in our waterways. Particularly as it pertains to oyster reefs. So oyster reefs are an endangered community, and and I'm not going to explain too much, I'm going to let the scientists explain it, but they really are important. They're an important part of our area and they're under threat. So tonight we're going to talk about the ways that we're protecting those oyster reefs that are left and also helping to re-establish reefs where they have been lost. We've got scientists joining us tonight from the Department of Primary Industries Fisheries, and then also from Local Land Services and the University of Newcastle. So I'll introduce them all in just a moment. But for the moment, I'm just going to share my screen and we're going to talk a little bit about the report card. So this is our annual waterway and catchment report card. And the way that this works is that annually we have scientists from the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment come and visit our estuaries and undertake monitoring in our waterways. And what they're looking for is a couple of different ecological health indicators. So they're looking at the turbidity in our waterways, and then also chlorophyll A, which is an indicator of algae present in the waterways. And lastly, we do seagrass monitoring as well. So up the top here, you can see areas that have a high conservation value have very low turbidity, few algae present in the water, and then also really healthy seagrasses, which are home to a lot of different wildlife. In a moderately disturbed catchment in the middle here, you can see the turbidity gets a little bit worse and we have more algae present. You can also see that our seagrasses aren't looking quite so good. And then in a heavily impacted environment, turbidity is really high, and then we've also got lots of algae present. So that's what we're looking for when we actually undertake the report card monitoring. Now, for everybody that lives in the Mid-Coast, they will know that 2019 and 20 was a very, very difficult year. We've come out of extended drought period. Well, and actually we were still in the extended drought period when we started sampling. And then we also had extreme bushfires throughout a lot of our catchments, followed by flooding rains. So just on our screen here, you can see that the 2019-20, while we had slightly higher than average rainfall, what you can actually see is that nearly all of that rainfall fell in February. And that's, much higher than our long-term averages in those periods. So this is our sampling periods, and you can see that we had 2 or 3 sampling periods really in the orange lines that were in drought conditions. We also had these 2 that were in fire conditions. Then we had a little bit of rain in January, followed by a lot of flooding rain in February, and then our final 2 samples under those rain conditions as well. So that really impacted the results this year. They were impacted, first of all, by the drought conditions, then the bushfire and the flood. The other thing that really impacted the results was the type of estuary that we're actually looking for, whether it was a river or a lake estuary, because they actually respond slightly differently. So you can see under low rainfall conditions, this is our river estuary over this side, really low flow, small inputs and low algal levels, and similar sort of thing happening in our lake, even though it has a longer residence time, which is just the amount of time that the water stays in the system. Under moderate rainfall though, which is what happened in January, we found that we had increased inputs, particularly in January. Obviously those inputs included fire debris. And also, because of the extended drought period, there wasn't a lot of ground coverage, so it allowed for more nutrients and sediment to get into the water. And so you have those increased inputs, you have increased turbidity, and then also high algal levels in both the river and the lake system. But what was really interesting this year and did affect the results is the way that those two different types of systems responded to high rainfall levels. So when we had those flooding conditions in February, our river estuaries had increased inputs, but low algal levels, because the flood conditions were running through the system so quickly that there was no conditions for those algae to grow. They were washed out into the ocean beforehand. However, in a lake system, because of the residence time, the amount of time that that material stays in the system, we still had those high algal levels. And so you can see these differences between our Wallace Lake results compared to, say, our Manning River results. So here's our report card for this year. The results are A to F, much like a school report card. So A is obviously quite a healthy waterway, B getting a little bit less, and then right through to F. Now, thankfully, we don't have any Fs in our systems. The lowest that we do have is C. And because of the increased conditions that we had this year with those fire and the different water quality issues, we did find that half of our sites dropped a level this year. So they went from either a B to a C or an A to a B. And then we had 9 sites that also remained the same as last year. So just quickly, just because we're going to be talking about the Wallace system tonight, I'll just quickly take you over the Wallace conditions. So we had 3 Cs and 3 Bs in Wallace Lake this year. All of them except for one dropped a grade, and that was the Mid-Willamette Estuary. Interestingly, Charlotte Bay, which has always been an A, did drop to a B this year, which shows that there was those increased inputs into the system. And it just had those perfect algal conditions. The water was hotter because of the drought conditions, and then we had that runoff as well. Willamette Cove and Kalungaluk Estuary were both driven by algae, which shows that there's input from those catchments. Pipers Creek drops from excellent to a good ecological condition, but funnily enough, that's more of a return to normal for Pipers Creek. It has a lot of input from a large suburban area, and so we find that heavily urbanized catchment does have a bit of an effect. And Wallace Lake dropped from excellent to good condition as well this year. So if you would like more information on the report card or would like to see the results from any other catchment, all you have to do is visit our website. Just go to the Midcoast website and type in report card, and that will take you to not only the results, but a full technical report, and the raw data is all on that site as well. But now we're going to talk a little bit more about what we're doing in our estuaries to help work with these. So once we get these results, they're not just results for us, we actually use them to plan our management actions and undertake new works. So what we're going to do is ask some of our scientists to join us now. So I've got Charlotte Jenkins and Vicky Cole joining us this evening. They're both from DPI Fisheries. Charlotte Jenkins is based on the far north coast of New South Wales and has worked with fisheries for 15 years. During this time, she has primarily worked on the delivery of a broad range of fish habitat restoration and conservation projects, and she is currently the fisheries manager in the New South Wales Oyster Reef Restoration Team. And Dr. Vicky Cole is also a scientist for the New South Wales Oyster Reef Restoration Team at Fisheries and is based in the Port Stephens Fisheries Institute. So I'll pass over and let these lovely ladies talk to you about oyster reefs.
We'll just start with some oyster reef basics and help provide some context for our talks today. So young shellfish have an active tendency to form aggregates. They like to stick together. Can you just move on to the next slide? Thanks, Vicky. And over time, they can actually build a dense, multi-layered structure. This can be made up of living and also dead shell. Now, in New South Wales, oysters love each other. They tend to aggregate and stick together. So in New South Wales, the size of the patch of oyster aggregation is important. So we're classing everything that's greater than 5 square meters or more than 2 shells thick as an oyster reef. Anything thinner than that, is more of an oyster veneer. Now, the reef could be one continuous unit, or it could be a mosaic of patches that's interspersed with other habitats such as seagrass beds sand or sediment. And in New South Wales, we've got several reef-forming species, but Sydney rock oysters are the predominant intertidal reef-forming species in New South Wales. We've also got other shellfish species too, such as mussels. We also get different types of oyster reefs and oyster beds. Here's a couple of examples. So we can get these low profile beds where we have a lot of clumping oysters, or these very high profile complex beds. It's an example of a low profile bed, but a different type of species. Some people might not have seen this one. This is actually leaf oysters. And then we also get these really dense aggregations with mangrove pneumatophores. So oysters are a small little critter, but when we have them in these large dense aggregations, they actually can make a really big impact, and they provide a wealth of really important ecosystem services to coastal communities of New South Wales. So oyster reefs can attenuate wave energy and protect shorelines from erosion, and in doing so can enhance the resilience of coastal communities to climate change. And along that same thread, they can also contribute to carbon sequestration, so store carbon in their shells, and also locking away organic carbon in their pseudofeces. So oysters are bivalves. That means they're natural filter feeders, and they pump large volumes of water through their bodies, and they capture tiny microscopic plankton on their cilia. In doing this, they also remove other particles from the water column, helping improve water clarity. So there's one study that showed a single wild oyster can actually filter 2 liters of water an hour. So just imagine what a dense aggregation of oysters can do. It's quite phenomenal. Significantly, these reefs also provide structure that serves as both shelter and foraging habitat. There's another study that found a reef supported over 300 different marine animal species. So that's pretty significant numbers there. And this also included recreational and commercially important fish species. So where are these mythical super habitats? Well, historical accounts and harvest records actually indicate a really impressive pre-colonial abundance of oyster reefs across many New South Wales estuaries. Here's just one quote from one early European explorer, where he said there were astronomical quality of seed oysters stretching for miles. We can delve deep into historical archives and study historical maps. And place names can also help us build a picture of places that were perhaps once bountiful in shellfish. So place names such as Oyster Harbour, Oyster Point, Oyster Creek, and here in the Manning on an 1840s map, there was an oyster reach. What happened? Where have our oyster reefs gone? Well, sadly, much of these colossal shellfish beds were actually lost very early on in European arrival. So there was a lot of destructive overharvesting for food, but also for lime, for construction. There's an image there of one of the largest shell lime kilns in Sydney, and the oysters in Shelley mortar. So historical sites in Sydney have a lot of oyster shell embedded in them. Now, this process was done often by dredging. So they removed all sizes of oysters, alive and dead, indiscriminate removal, and also the hard substrate was removed too. And that's critical really for the future of the oyster reefs. As the population swelled and expanded, then catchment clearing occurred. And this led to erosion and sedimentation and a smothering of a lot of estuarine habitats, including oyster reefs. So these impacts and stresses, coupled with likely introduction of new or more virulent strains of pathogens, things such as mudworm, which decimated reefs in the late 1800s, really led to the complete eradication of subtidal oyster reefs and a drastic reduction in intertidal oyster reef habitat. The loss of shellfish ecosystems is widely recognised as one of the key drivers in the long-term degradation of coastal waterways. And it's not just an issue in New South Wales. So this loss has occurred across Australia. In fact, 99% of oyster reefs in Australia are estimated to be functionally extinct. So we may still see oyster reefs in our systems, but they may be in such low abundance they're not providing those same functions I talked about earlier that they once did. But also globally, oyster reefs are heavily impacted, and they're actually estimated to be one of the most threatened marine ecosystems. But not many people know about it. So a lot of people know about coral reefs and the health of the Great Barrier Reef, but shellfish reefs were lost so long ago, and very early on in documented forms of records, that people believe that something called generational amnesia has occurred. So the loss of the ecosystem occurred so long ago, it's actually outside of living memory. So what's being done about it? Well, the restoration of these habitats has been gaining momentum globally, and the USA has certainly been leading the charge in this area. And for the last 2 decades, they've been doing a lot of work in this space. But large-scale projects are starting to get underway in Australia now, which is great. And the restoration simply involves the reintroduction of a hard substrate, such as sterile shells, so it could be oyster shells or other shellfish, limestone or other types of rocks. And in some cases overseas, they've used concrete and prefabricated structures as well. So this substrate provides a suitable surface for young juvenile oysters or spat to settle on, and this forms the foundation of a reef and serves to elevate the developing reef out of the sediment. So this new substrate is often placed in an area where there's known good levels of natural spat fall, so the reef can regenerate naturally. However, in some cases where oysters have been so heavily decimated, there often isn't a natural recruitment anymore in the system. And in this scenario, then a hatchery-reared spat is introduced to the new reef substructure. These images here are from the Port Phillip Bay restoration site, and they had to do just that. They had to use hatchery-reared spat. So over time, in the right conditions, a self-sustaining complex ecosystem forms. Why do restoration? As we learn more about the value of oyster reef habitat and just how important it is, and we come to realize more and more the significance of the loss of this habitat, we can obviously see the benefits of restoring these type of habitats to our systems. Like Erin was saying, some of our systems are heavily impacted, and oyster reefs have been shown to have a benefit in areas where oysters can still survive. So there's shown to enhance biodiversity. One study, as an example, showed that there was a 212% increase in fish and invertebrate biomass from a reef restoration project compared to a mud bottom. So mud bottom still provides habitat, but the reef was providing more structure, and there was a greater biomass there. Increases in estuary productivity. It can provide a conduit for waste product management, and that's the shell from oyster aquaculture produced in the same system. It can be put back into that system and used as one of those substrates for recruitment. We also get really great positive community engagement from these kind of projects, and really help foster stewardship in the local community for doing something to improve their local waterway. The knock-on benefits into enhanced recreational and tourism opportunities, and can provide really big boosts to regional economies. One estimate for a project off Kangaroo Island, for example, put the economic value just from fishing tourism alone from a reef restoration project at 1.7 million per annum. So pretty significant numbers, and that's just from fishing tourism. So there's lots of other benefits too. So what's happening in New South Wales? Well, in late 2018, the New South Wales government released a new marine estate management strategy, and this is to guide protection and improvements across the marine estate, so all the coastal lakes and estuaries, lagoons. And this was built on what's called a TARA, threat and risk assessment, that identified key threats in the marine estate and set about a series of actions as to how to address those threats. The TARA had a huge amount of community and stakeholder input into it, And oyster reef restoration was selected as an important on-ground action under the key goal to improve water quality. So a really important feature and quite unique aspect of our project is that the team really draws on expertise from management and also science. So there's a number of activities going on underneath the project. So a really great part is trying to address that generational amnesia I mentioned earlier, and really starting to try and share the story of oyster reefs and how important they are to our estuaries and their loss, and how we can restore them in certain areas. So we've produced a range of education and communication products. They're all on our website. If you will provide that web address at the end. We've done a lot of direct stakeholder engagement and really some areas of social science with our key stakeholders. So early on in the project, we worked with the aquaculture industry and had a targeted survey for them. And really that was a way to try and find out how much they knew about oyster reefs, about oyster reef restoration, about any beds and reefs that still exist in their local estuaries, and also as a way to provide an avenue for any concerns that they may have about oyster reef restoration to be raised. So we had a really great participant rate there. We've got a similar one open at the moment for recreational fishers. We've been starting engagement with the Aboriginal community. Unfortunately, that has been put on hold largely because of COVID. We're also really making sure that we engage well and liaise and communicate and collaborate with our peers. There's a lot of work going on in shellfish reef restoration space at the moment, and so there's really great opportunities to learn from each other, from practitioners and scientists, of course. And community presentations such as this. So we're also really paving the way, really, so trying to set up products and information that others can do oyster reef restoration into the future. So the desire to do it is really gaining momentum with community groups, local councils and other government departments. So we've drafted soon to be released how to oyster reef restoration in New South Wales, and this is addressing a lot of the planning and regulatory I guess framework that you have to get through to do a project such as this, and providing advice for funding, and then developing advice for local councils with coastal management programs. We are also doing a lot of work internally. So oyster reefs, it's very much a buzzword at the moment, but it has been overlooked up till now in our current legislation. So we're working internally to get them recognised as a key fish habitat under our policies, working and liaising with our marine park staff and also aquaculture management, and lots of discussions going on about the management of them currently in our systems and future, and how they interact with different activities that are going on in our contemporary estuaries. So one thing we're doing at the moment, and what I was actually doing today out on the Bellinger-Kalang River, is mapping remnant reefs. And so before we move forward with shellfish reef restoration in New South Wales, we really need to get a better understanding of what's still there, because there are still reefs and beds existing in our estuaries today. And so we're doing this through a 6-step process that you can see here on the slide. And step 1 was for us to define the characteristics of a reef in New South Wales. We really didn't want to go and collect information about every single clump of oysters we came across. So setting that definition was really key, and that's what I provided you with at the very start. We worked with our GIS team to create a geodatabase of information, and in this is aerial and satellite imagery fed into that. And then this is where the historical and local stakeholder information can be fed in. And part of this, we've also developed an online citizen science opportunity. So there's a shellfish reef reporter. It's a tool online, and anyone can go on and drop a virtual pin on a map to identify a shellfish reef in their local estuary. So if anyone knows of any, please go and find that and drop them in and help us create this database. That would be great. So then we head out in the field, like our colleague there in the top there, that's Jill. She's on the South Coast. We go out in the field, we verify and collect information. That then gets rechecked back in the office, and we compile a map for each estuary and create a shellfish reef map. And they look something like this. So this a South Coast estuary, this is Wodonga Inlet, and you can see the different colours there. That's different types of reef that have been mapped. So there's some high profile ones there in Wodonga, a couple of low profile. Looks like Jill recorded some clumping oysters too. And the beauty of having the map digitally means we can then really use this tool for future projects and planning, and we can overlay that information with other map layers that are available. So Wodonga is within a marine park, so we can overlay the marine park zone map. Also on here, we've got oyster aquaculture areas that are active at the moment. And then we've also got priority oyster aquaculture areas as well. We can overlay any information we've got digitally as a map. So it could be bathymetry, so that's important for our oysters. We could more logistical things such as any conflicts like boating and shipping lanes, that can be added in. Any impacts that are known, such as acid sulfate soil hotspots. So really is a great tool for future planning of restoration projects. So this is underway at the moment. We've currently done the field validation of 14 estuaries. They're complete, and we're still working on others. The Mid-Coast Council region is planned primarily for early 2021, so we are getting there. And the completed maps will be available online, or send us an email. We can provide them to you once we've had them all verified. And we've developed a mapping video to show just how we're going through that process. If you're interested, that's on YouTube. So finally, I'll finish off on one of our biggest achievements to date. Really, this is the on-ground pilot oyster reef restoration project in Port Stephens. And I must highlight that our colleague Kirk Daly was responsible for the successful delivery of these works. So like many New South Wales estuaries, the lack of suitable substrate is thought to be the significant limiting factor in the natural regeneration of oyster reef. So this site was chosen as the pilot. So the works were timed to be placed at the peak settlement period for native Sydney rock oysters, to try and maximise their recruitment above other encrusting species. Last thing we wanted was to try and set up a Sydney rock oyster reef and have it encrusted with Pacifics or another species. So that period is January to March. And so 2 restoration locations were chosen. You can see here on the map down the bottom, we've got the Miles site at the eastern side of the port. It's very marine influenced, and it was built on a large intertidal sand flat area there. And then the Karua, the other pin there on the western side of the port. This is a lot more estuarine. It has more fine mud and sediment and poorer water quality. And also significantly about this site, also has a large abundance of abandoned oyster lease infrastructure. So public consultation was organised and started in late 2018 to assist with project development and approval and the licence application, because even though a government department, we still need licensing and approvals to do this kind of work. So that was all lodged as well. And we really were testing new ground here. It was new Crown lands legislation we were working under. Oyster reef restoration was viewed as a new type of on-ground works. So as you can imagine, there were many wrinkles for Kirk to iron out, and certainly tested the patience of the Port Stephens team. But really proud to say the project has been successful. So these are just a couple more images. On the left there, you've got the Mile barge loading site at the top, and that's the barge being loaded up there. And then the deployment site there on the sand flat with the rock. The restoration treatment was simply to provide a suitable oyster settlement substrate. So here the local quarried rock was used, and also oyster shell that had been collected by oyster farmers in the port for 12 months for the whole 12 months leading up to the project. The construction took 75 days, and in total 3,300 tons of rock and 180 cubic meters of oyster shell was used. That created just over 1 hectare of oyster reef base in total. So that was a third at the Miles site there on the left. You can see some of the finished reef structures, and 2/3 at the Karua site, and it is interspersed amongst the aquaculture legacy infrastructure there. So 1 year of pre-monitoring was conducted in the port, and now the post-monitoring is underway. And so on that note, and sorry for the technical glitches at the start, I will hand over to our team scientist, Vicky Cole, and she's going to explain the science behind reef restoration.
So research started off by developing goals for oyster reef restoration in Port Stephens, and also to understand the ecological variability in remnant oyster reefs. We did a small pilot study to see if locally sourced rock or clean shell was better for oyster recruitment. But I guess the main part of the work is to experimentally test if oyster reef restoration is successful. Remnant oyster reefs in the bay are generally either small natural reefs or historical rock leases, like in this video. Our research focused on the ecological benefits of oyster reefs through pre- and post-construction monitoring of natural settlement of oysters, invertebrates, and fish. In the West Basin, we tested augmentation of an old rock lease, which is to fill the spaces. Prior to restoration works, old rock lease was making up approximately 6,000 square meters. I'm going to focus on the results of the Miles site, where we tested construction of the new oyster reef. So the site was predominantly sand, with existing oyster reefs only about 100 square meters. This is how we hypothesized the results of our new study. So what oyster reef restoration should look like if it's successful. We start off with a pre-sampling in early 2019, and we sampled twice a season in the oyster reef restoration sites, reference sites, and the sediment control sites. We're currently in the restoration, the post-restoration stage. We're looking to see if the monitoring will show us how long it will take us for the restoration site to increase and become similar to the natural oyster reefs. This plot here shows assemblages of oysters and the invertebrates that were sampled in the reference oyster reef sites and the sediment sites, and the sites that were going to be restored. So basically, shapes that are close together represent samples that are more similar. Over here, we observed more than 40 species of invertebrates, mostly mollusks, such as gastropods, bivalves, crustaceans, including crabs and amphipods, and worms such as polychaetes. Clearly, the assemblages in the oyster reef reference sites, which are in the light blue, are very different from the control sediment sites in red and the pre-restoration site in dark blue. One example was the snail, Bembissium auratum, that although the abundance varied over time, you can see they were exclusively on oyster reefs. We also sampled fishes. Those were with mini browse. Mini browse are GoPros on a small weighted frame that was baited with pilchards. Previous research has shown mini browse to be successful for sampling fishes in intertidal and complex habitat. We identified more than 55 species of fish with the bream, glassfish, blennies, gobies, rays, and whiting being the most abundant. Oyster reef sites had many more species than the sand, and this is pretty consistent throughout the year. Earlier this year, the restoration work was completed, as Charlie explained. Combined between the Kura and Myall sites, the area of the new reef footprint was 1 hectare, and this was nearly doubled with twice the area of oyster reefs at the sites. So it's been approximately 9 months since the on-ground works were completed. There has been considerable natural recruitment of Sydney rock oysters, and some are already quite large. We have conservatively estimated that there are more than 50 million oysters naturally recruited to the rock and shell. The goal is for the sizes with baby oysters, shown in this top panel, to grow up and become like an established oyster reef, as shown in the bottom panel. Many fish, including bream, showed a rapid response to the on-ground works. Previously, there were none in the restoration site and very few in the control site. But with the addition of rock and shell, bream numbers increased early this year, and by March, the restoration site had similar average abundance to those detected in the oyster reefs. We also did some experiments comparing filtration by established oyster reefs in situ compared to the new restoration site. Control chambers were placed over bare sand and subtracted from the estimates of filtration by reefs to account for any settling particles. This graph here shows per chamber the filtration rate by baby oysters on the restored reef compared to the established reef. You can see that after a very short time, the babies on the new reef were already filtering quite a lot, which we calculated to be over 400,000 litres of water per hour. So, just to summarise the main results of our study, we sampled 8 sites twice a season for the year at the Kura and Myall sites. We found oyster reefs support more than 40 species of invertebrates and more than 55 species of fish. And in the 9 months since restoration work began on the 1 hectare new reef, we have doubled the area of existing oyster reefs. More than 50 million oysters have recruited, and these babies are already filtering more than 400 litres of water per hour. And they're supporting lots of habitat for many fish and invertebrates, which will only increase over time. So in addition to DPI's monitoring work of the Port Steedman reefs, we're also involved in a number of collaborations on oyster reef restoration. We're working with the University of Newcastle to create a novel method of sampling fish in oyster reefs with environmental DNA from samples of water and comparing them to browse. We're also working with Macquarie University. We were trying a new method using biodegradable oyster reef structures made from potato starch. These trials will be done in Port Stephens, Port Hacking and Bermuda. Up north, we're also working with Southern Cross University on the species of oyster that very little is known about, called the leaf oyster. What's really interesting is it lives in areas that many native oysters don't do very well. And finally, we're involved in a large collaborative project that looks at what factors influence the types of species associated with oyster reefs, and the optimum size and shape of oyster reefs should be really important for future restoration. Thank you, everyone. For more information, you can read about our work on the MEMS website or contact Charlie or myself.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Charlotte and Vicky. Really great presentation. Some really interesting stuff going on in that area. I think that probably there's very few people that have any knowledge of oyster reefs or just how important they are, and we've lost so many. So it's really great to see so much interesting work happening, trying to bring these guys back and rehabilitate those oyster reefs. Vicky, that information about what's happening down in the Mile site is really interesting, and to see what's happening and see how those different the results of the different research and what it's bringing back, and that it's not just restoring the reefs, that we're actually researching what's working, what's not working, and those sorts of things. That's, I think, so important, because moving forward, we'll as we increase knowledge, that's really important. So is there any other places in the Mid-Coast that this sort of Brian and Troy are going to talk later about the Willamba, but is it just sort of in the Mile area, or is there any further up, or are you focusing on any other areas, or just using this as a trial site?
Yeah, so Port Stephens was the first site in New South Wales.
Yeah.
So we did the one at the Courier and the one in Mile, and they're pretty much all there is. It's been very small projects that have looked at, I guess, a single bank or something quite small like that.
Yep.
Yeah, it's quite new, and I guess what Brian's working on is also pretty new.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's
well, and that's great, because that's, as we said, that's that research side of things. That's starting small and researching and finding out more, and then bringing in more trial sites and those sorts of things. So that's fantastic that those are the early sites that we're working on.
Yeah, so it's exciting we get to choose the first one. But yeah, looking forward to new sites in the future.
Yeah.
But that's kind of up to Charlie and Jill and all the work they do to decide where it'll be.
Some of those videos that you played earlier, just asking if they're accessible to everyone, or if you have a web page that has all of this information, or is this something that you're just presenting tonight and not something that we can access?
There's a number of videos on our project webpage. I'll type the address into the chat in a second, and it was on the end of our slide. So yeah, there's a few videos on there that you can have a look at. There's one of the construction one. We're constantly uploading new material, so have a look on that project webpage.
So thank you again, Charlotte and Victoria. We're really interesting there, and we'll bring you back in a few moments. All right, so we're going to pass across to our next presenters. And we have with us Brian Hughes, who is an estuary and marine officer with 14 years experience that works with LLS. Brian's a bit of a local legend and definitely an expert on the region. He's undertaking all sorts of works through the Mid-Coast area. He works on different education projects, and then also on-ground works, which is what he's going to be talking about tonight. So we thank him for joining us. And then we also have Associate Professor Troy Gaston, who is an estuarine ecologist at the University of Newcastle. And he spent the last 9 years investigating estuarine function and productivity. Troy works with local councils, state government like LLS, industry and community groups to increase our understanding of how estuaries work. And his team, the Marine and Coastal Science team at the university, have a long history with Wallace Lake, and they have a few different projects underway at the moment. So I'm going to ask both Brian and Troy to take over, and they're going to chat to us about the projects that are happening in the Willamba River.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Erin. And yeah, it has been a really exciting project for us, and been great to see all the work that DPI Fisheries have been doing down in Port Stephens. So really lucky to have that in our Hunter LLS region. Lots of work happening, and obviously working in the Port Stephens Great Lakes Marine Park down there. So that's really fantastic to see, and really great collaboration with the oyster industry. And so my opening slide just shows where our initial work happened at Gariba Island, which is in the Willamba River in Wallace Lake. And it's I'll just firstly just a little bit of background why why do oyster reef restoration in Wallace Lake in particular? Well, Charlie talked about the loss of oyster reefs across Australia and the world, but in Wallace Lake in particular, you know, our seafood industry, so oyster farmers and fishermen, are needing to adapt to a whole range of changes. So what the market wants in terms of oysters for consumption. So there's been a change from the older stick oysters to single seed oysters. We've seen lots of changes in the catchment, as Erin spoke about. We've had the training of the entrance with breakwalls, which has changed the tidal regime of the estuary, lots of changes to land use. We're seeing changes to the climate, so rainfall patterns and the amount of rainfall we're getting and temperatures increasing, etc. And all those things affect habitat, fish stocks, and you know, oyster production tends to suffer when we do have high rainfall periods. And so in response to that, oyster farmers in particular have tried to adapt and change their cultivation techniques and the kind of infrastructure they're using. But fishermen, especially commercial fishermen, really value some of that older type of infrastructure, which the oyster farmers are moving away from. There's a really good habitat. So one of the things we thought, and I guess we're testing out, is that oyster reefs and construction of those might help us adapt and maybe offset some of the changes in habitat as the infrastructure changes. So this is a really good example of the two main seafood industries working together. That on the left is Danny Elliott. He's a local commercial fisherman. On the right's Anthony Saka. He's a local oyster farmer, and they've both been very active in a whole range of environmental projects. And here they're filling up a Koya bag for our restoration project. We have actually tended not to use the bags so much, but this was early on, and you know, we've had a lot of discussions with the two industries about how they can, I guess, co-adapt to some of the changes that are taking place. Yeah, we've worked with Troy's team to try and understand how, I'll just go back. You can kind of see in the background behind Anthony, there's a big pile of sticks, treated sticks, and that's one of the things that has been changing in Wallace Lake and the rest of New South Wales with the Sydney rock oyster production. So they're tending to use different gear now. Sometimes, you know, getting spat from hatchery, or they're catching spat on slats rather than the old tar coated sticks. And then those, what we call single seed oysters, go out in different kinds of gear. And here you can see some tumblers, and that's Tim Smith, who is with James Cook Uni now, but previously worked with Troy, and heading out to do some sampling of the kind of fish and invertebrates that are found around this type of gear, as opposed to some of the old stick infrastructure. So in Wallace Lake, this is basically shows the lower end of the Willamba River. You can see a little channel on the left. This is what we call the cut, and there are some historical records that, or from a local, bit of a true local legend, Vic Bramble, that Aboriginal people used to come across from the left, where there's a tip of Minimbar, across to right across to Tuncurry, where you can see those houses on the right there. Yeah, and I guess so we've, in Wallace Lake, we do have a fair bit of remnant oyster reef. Some of this is probably natural, but then there's also some structures that are related to previous forms of cultivation. So this is at Point Road, Tuncurry. You can see some newer gear there. I think they're slats catching spat there. But in this area here, you've got these shell beds, and that a long time ago, that was how they actually cultivated the oysters. They used to, it was backbreaking work. They basically create an intertidal habitat using sand and cabbage tree palms, and then spread the oysters on top of that structure, and they would rake them regularly to get good shape. And when they stopped doing that, some of these areas they dredged, but other areas they left behind, and they've had more baby oysters come and settle on them, and they've actually become oyster reefs in the way that Charlie described earlier. We also have similar structures to what was shown in Vicky's talk, where we've had these other forms of cultivation where you can see there were old rack and rail of the stick cultivation, where that stuff's degraded, but it's had lots of oysters catch on it. So we have that in Wallace Lake too. And this is just a photo of over near Wallace Island, where we have some of these kind of structures. And this is a close-up view. That's Anthony Saka there on one of his leases, where you've still got this shell bed, and you can see in addition to the oysters, which have a very healthy growing edge on them there, you've got mussels, and I can tell you there's lots of other things happily growing in amongst there. Some of the snails that Vicky mentioned, and algae, and right next door to that you see some of that seagrass. So it's a very healthy ecosystem within a commercial oyster lease. The Gariba site that we worked on is shown here in the Willamba River, right on the tip of Gariba Island, the upstream end. I got involved with this. Council had undertaken a project where you can see all these posts. There's some Koya logs which are just remaining at that point, but they had also planted some mangroves behind, about 1 per metre, which you can see, and you know, it's an actively eroding site, and they're really concerned about the loss of the Koya logs and those mangroves that they'd planted being washed out again. So we decided to do something new, and that was to add some oysters fairly thickly on the bank. So again, similar to Port Stephens, we were using oysters that would otherwise have just been discarded. So we're reusing those from within Wallace Lake, and placing those around the mangroves without damaging the mangroves, trying to hold that bank together and the bed, and letting those mangroves continue to grow. And eventually what we're hoping is we'll have the oysters will catch some more spat, and they will form a reef, and the mangroves will continue to grow, and we'll get a stable bank. So this is from the first day when we started, when we were still trying to work things out. You can see we have these 1 cubic metre bins of oyster shell. We're placing that oyster shell in between the mangroves, and building that up against the bank. And this is just looking upstream on Gariba Island. You can see the mangroves poking out of the oyster shell, and you can see that we've put those oysters fairly thickly right up to almost the top of the bank there, and those oysters are holding pretty well. They have been moved around. This was about 18 months ago when we first started doing the work, and but one of my theories is that if we can at least stabilise the bed so the oysters get firmly placed into the bed, that will stop the bed eroding, and the mangroves will continue to grow. We have been impacted by the fires there. We lost a few mangroves as the fire swept over from Minimba across the island, but generally we were pretty well spared there. And then we also had a minor flood in February where the site was inundated, the site's fared pretty well since then. So this is a photo following that in this situation, we actually had a lot of natural recruitment of mangroves. You can see they're pretty close together. We actually placed the oysters in front of those mangroves, but there is a lot of boat activity in this part of the river, and all that boat wash actually washed all those oysters in closer to the bank. So actually helped us out, which was an interesting observation. So we now have a permit from Fisheries to do some more of this kind of work. And so this was the original site up at the top of Kariba, and we're going right down the channel here, down from Kariba Island down to Chapman's Island and along this foreshore here at Chapman's Road. So yeah, we've started doing some work there, but we've had to change tack a little bit. So we're just using the seed oysters, so we don't have any oysters with tar on them, and we can't, get the volume of oysters to do significant reaches of the river. So we've just shifted to using less oysters, as you can see here, not right to the top of the bank, but trying to get that wave protection by using what we're calling timber fillets. Some of you may have seen rock fillets before that protect the toe of the bank. So we're trying to use some more natural materials to achieve a similar outcome. And we've started that process a few months ago, and Troy's team is monitoring that, as well as the original site at Kariba. So I'll just show you a few photos of that. This is one of the oyster farmer labourers, Hayden, on a site. You can see we've virtually, we haven't disturbed the bank or any of the vegetation at all. All the mangroves, whatever mangroves have survived in the erosion, they're still there, and we are hoping to plant some more if need be. But we're also monitoring, the recruitment. We're doing these stretches of up to about 20 metres in between where the mangroves are, reasonably healthy, like on the left there. And that's that photo shows Darren Coombs, who's been really one of the oyster farmers, but he also does some other work and really good with an excavator and those sorts of things. So he's been really valuable in this, trying this new technique. Some of those bags I mentioned before, we're sort of using to complement these structures, sort of blocking up, putting them at the ends to prevent some of those erosive waves coming in and eroding the bank. We have had some breaches of the rock fillet, so we've added a few bags in there, which will hopefully help speed up the mangrove recruitment in those areas, and possibly some oyster reef formation behind the rock fillets. And yeah, that's pretty much an overview of what we've been doing. Troy will talk now, and then I've got one more slide after he finishes. So
thank you, Brian. So all these projects are just about getting the science together so we can really understand the best way to tackle these issues, which we have throughout our estuaries. So Brian's alluded to the project that's going on, and we've come in to work with Brian and his team to try and understand how these systems are they recovering? Are we having an effect? Because as Erin mentioned previously, a lot of my work is about, and the group that I work with is, how do we best target our on-ground actions so we can get the best bang for our buck with repairing our systems? So we've already had a brief background to oyster reefs, what they can do, what they used to do, what we want them to do again. Brian's just given a great background to this project. So I'm just now going to talk about what it is we've done and some of the preliminary monitoring data, some of that science that we actually need to know what we're doing. Is it the best thing that we're doing on ground? So Brian's just alluded to that we've got a foreshore erosion issue or a bank stabilisation issue. What can we add to that to get these healthy ecosystems? Because we've got concern over foreshore erosion, this loss of natural habitat. The oyster reefs we've lost, was it 85% or up to 85% globally. We've got lots of stresses going on in our waterways. We want to keep using them. So what can we do to help these systems repair? Is there a natural alternative? And Brian's just talked about some of these natural materials that we can use to help the ecosystem along with its repair. So I've had the coir logs were used, but they had limited success. So we're going to use oyster shells. Wallace Lake has got the industry to do this, although we're probably going to have not enough oyster shells if we're building oyster reefs in Port Stephens and other areas of the coast. We want to use it for foreshore stabilisation. Maybe this is a push by the oyster industry for us to eat a whole lot more oysters, because we need more oyster shells. We've seen the evidence elsewhere and from Charlie and Vicky's projects, how oyster reefs can improve water quality. They do reduce erosion. We can improve local biodiversity. We can increase fishing productivity. We can get healthy ecosystems back by getting these habitats that we've lost back into the system. So what we were doing in this project was using the oyster shell and live oyster rock as a foreshore stabilisation and rehabilitation tool. So it's basically creating a foreshore oyster reef, and can we facilitate that natural rehabilitation of the bank there, and we can see the extent of some of the erosion. So this project was actually to look at providing some baseline data before and after. Now Vicky alluded to that with the figure showing this is what natural reef systems will look like. Here's if we have an affected system, can we go from an affected system state to a natural state by some sort of intervention? So we need that before and after data to really understand what's going on in the system. So that's what we did. Brian's just pointed out where we were on Greeba Island. We did actually have an area that had not been touched, that is not near where this stabilisation is going on. That's our control location, so we can see what's happening naturally. We've got areas where the coir ropes have been staked out, and then we've brought the oyster shell in. And in some areas, there's just bare oyster shell, nothing else on the against the bank, and then we've got coir ropes and oyster shell, and sometimes we had a mix of coir rope, oyster shell, and oyster rock going in. So we sampled before and after all of this happened. We're measuring some of the physical and biological variables. And also we're measuring fish as well, because that's often the proximal link to us, to humans, and perhaps how a lot of people use these waterways, which is from a recreational fishing perspective. So the boys have had a lot of fun doing the field work. So we're actually measuring the sediment characteristics. Are we seeing sediments coming back? Are we actually increasing bank erosion? We want to make sure we're not doing that. And then we also wanted to measure what was going on with the biology. So looking at the faunal communities, are we getting natural oyster recruitment? Are we seeing macroinvertebrates come back, which is living in the sediment, and they're often or living within the oyster shell matrix, and they're often food for other organisms. And then are we getting the fish back? And we were using a range of methods there. We're using the fish traps. We tried using some underwater cameras, and we've even started using underwater sonar, simply because the sonar works in complete darkness and really highly turbid water, whereas visual cameras aren't so good there. So what have we found? So I've got a few graphs for you here. The first one I want you to look at is in the top right-hand corner. We're just here measuring what's actually happening with the sediment accretion. So what we can see here, anything that is above zero in that top graph means we're actually getting more sediments into the system. Now, we measured this by putting out stakes. They were at a known height, and we looked at how much the sediment had moved up those stakes. And at the sites where the stakes remained, because as Brian alluded to, we've had flood, we've had fire, we've got lots of wave action. We are actually seeing over time, the sediments are now staying in the system, but they're actually coming back, which is great. For bank stability, now this was a little bit variable. So that's the bottom graph on the right here. We've got our different sites where we've added the oyster shell. If it's at zero, that means there's been no bank erosion or bank accretion. And then we can see that some sites we've had a little bit of accretion of the bank, so it's actually growing back out into the waterway, but then at other sites the bank is still eroding. So we haven't quite stopped all the erosion yet, but we've at least stopped it or increased the bank moving into the estuary at some locations. For the for other sediment characteristics, one thing we want to do is to see more of the fine-grained sediments. So what we've got here, the top row of graphs is before any work was done. The bottom row of graphs is the work, are the results after the shells went in. And what we can see, if you focus on the bottom colour, which I guess is a brown and a purple, they're the coarse grains that we typically find in estuary sediments. And we actually want to see less of those. We're in an estuary, we're upstream, we expect to find a lot more fine-grained sediments. So by putting in the oyster shells, we've actually lost a lot of the coarse and gravel grain sizes, and we're seeing more of the medium and fine ones. And that would be because the oyster shells are actually buffering some of that wave action and allowing those medium and fine-grained sediments to actually settle out and become part of the foreshore again. And that's something we actually wanted, but it is a very slow process. So we're going to have to keep monitoring this one over time. For the animals, as Vicky and Charlotte alluded to, we want to put out these reefs. We want to see the oysters coming back naturally. And what we actually did find, regardless of which site you were at, and this is the graph on the right-hand side there, and it didn't matter if you were low on the shore or high on the shore, where we put that oyster shells out, there were new recruits. So the natural spat was actually settling out on these reefs and helped to create a better foreshore reef. We also noticed that with the macroinvertebrates, and that's the picture in the bottom left-hand corner there, we were seeing a lot more animals living in the sediments after we'd actually put these reefs in. Now, it's early days yet, because you've got to wait for the sediments to come back in and start to build up, and then the macroinvertebrates will move in after that. So it wasn't a huge increase that we saw, but we did see an increase in abundance and an increase in diversity, which is very promising for such an early stage in this rehabilitation process. For the fish, and looking at the picture on the left-hand side there, that's a video grab. So we don't always get the best water quality. It's not super clear, and that's not unexpected for being this far upstream an estuary. But you can see it's either a brim or a tarwine on the left-hand side there. I can't quite see its snout. Because it's really hard to use a visual camera, the image on the right there, we're deploying an underwater sonar, which uses sound to give us an image of the fish that are swimming around. So we want to see if the larger bodied fish are actually coming in and using these reefs that we're putting on the foreshore. So are we seeing that whole ecosystem coming back? And that's what this research is all about. So just to wrap up what that actually means, we're seeing new oyster recruits, which is great. It doesn't matter what the foreshore stabilization has been. Wherever you put the oyster shell, we're actually seeing new oyster recruits. We've seen some sediment accretion with the fine and medium-sized grains, which is exactly what we want. So there's a little bit of bank stabilization in progress there, but it will be a very, very slow process. We're seeing the species richness and abundance of the macroinvertebrates increasing. However, it's not a huge increase, but that will also be slow. And as Brian alluded to, we've got mangroves can actually colonise and start to grow behind where those oyster shells have actually been put in. So what's actually happening now is, as Brian said, we've got more sites. He's got approval from DPI to do that. We're actually going to continue the monitoring for another 2.5 years. And we've refined our methods, especially with the fish, to make sure we can see any changes that our on-ground works are actually bringing to the ecosystem, because we really want to know what is the best way for us to aid the ecosystem in the repair of our waterways. So that's what UON's up to at the moment, working on this project with LLS. And I guess we're all quite happy now to take a few questions if you've got some.
Thank you so much, Brian and Troy, for that presentation. That was fantastic. So great to see this work happening in the Mid-Coast area. Obviously, the Willambo River and the report card results show that that area is quite heavily impacted by the catchment and around it. So it's great to see these works happening to try and reduce those impacts. So Troy, you said that you're going to continue monitoring for another 2.5 years. This is a question to both of you. What are you thinking long term after that monitoring? Is this something that you would continue doing, or is it something that you're then looking to get those results of that research and possibly move to other areas in the Mid-Coast?
Yeah, I guess what we're trying to understand is the principles and the trends with what we're doing. We certainly, and that I did have one more slide, which I don't need to show, but we do have another project with the University of Sunshine Coast. They've done some interesting work up around Noosa, looking at, where you might put oyster reefs within a system. And I know that Charlie and the guys at DPI are looking at that and how councils can prioritise oyster reef restoration in their coastal management programs that coastal councils are working on at the moment. So we've got that project happening whilst Ben's been stuck in Queensland with all the coronavirus stuff. But I'm hoping that he'll be able to get down and do some field work early in the new year. And I'm also hopeful that we could do a similar project in the Manning. And Charlie mentioned previously about, finishing the mapping for the Mid-Coast area. So hopefully those things will sort of tie into each other and we can work together on that. And we can start to identify, the best places. Obviously, the Gariba Island site is, we're trying to get multiple outcomes. And in some ways, if we get a stable foreshore and the oysters don't quite take, I'd still be happy. But if we get a better understanding of how all the different estuarine habitats are connected within, say, Wallace Lake, and where might be particularly good spots to put an oyster reef just for that habitat, then we'll have a good idea of where we could put that, and we can go through the similar painful process that Kirk went through in Port Stephens. Should I get all the approvals necessary and create some good habitat? But what we now know is with those breakwalls have, basically changed Wallace Lake forever. And so we're not so much trying to restore it to what it was, but we're trying to adapt with it as it changes to that new tidal regime and becomes a different type of estuary. And so we can continue to have a good water quality and good fisheries production. And so we might end up trying to do some sites further downstream where it might be a bit easier to get those oysters to grow and recruit.
Yeah, and Willambo is so impacted by so many different things, as you mentioned, the boat wash and then also the catchment. So it's really good to see those different things happening. Where would you see oyster reefs in 10 years? Like we're in these early phases of research and we're looking at trying to restore them. What are you hoping for in the next 10 years in terms of this oyster reef area?
I guess what we should mention is there's been a large program that's just been announced with the Nature Conservancy with funding from the federal government. So that is going to start delivering more oyster reef restoration projects on the ground in the next 3 to 4 years. So that's short term. That's what will be happening. Obviously, we're conducting the mapping and looking to do more community work and collaborate with, as Brian said, with other organisations and get more happening on the ground. We're really keen to develop what we're doing further based on the science that we're going to find from this ARC linkage programme and from the Leaf Oyster Project and all these great research projects that are going on, and start looking at some other kind of, novel things to do with oyster reef restoration. So maybe different species. So there's a lot of work, obviously, in New South Wales with Sydney Rock. South Coast projects may start looking more at Angazi, so our native flat oyster, which was really heavily decimated. But then also the leaf oyster that Vicky mentioned, it's could be this, it's surviving in areas where Sydney rocks don't really like, it's quite silty, I should say, pH issues from acid. So it could potentially be a really good oyster to use for future projects. So we're just kind of looking at different different novel approaches to how oyster reef restoration might look in the future, and who will be doing it. So it might not be us or Brian, it might be a community group, or it might be the oyster farmers themselves. I really see that's where it's going. There's a lot of momentum in this space at the moment. And certainly there's a lot of growing enthusiasm and interest to see these kind of works being done in people's local estuaries and popular fishing spots and that kind of thing. So I think the next 10 years is a really exciting space for shellfish reef restoration.
We also need to remember that our estuaries are what I would call a mosaic of habitats. So oyster reefs that's one we're now understanding more about, and there's still a lot more to learn. As scientists, we always remember the more we know, the more we realise we don't know. So with the oyster reefs, we've got different types of foreshore stabilisation going on. We're also doing the salt marsh rehabilitation. So we need to look at all the different habitats an estuary would ordinarily have. And as Brian alluded to, where could those areas actually be put back in our estuaries? We're not quite sure where they used to be 200, 1,000, 2,000 years ago. So as scientists, we're trying to piece together, and the historical information that Charlie and Vicky have been using have helped us decide, well, this is where the oyster reefs used to be in our lifetimes. So let's try and get them back there. And now we need to try and work out, well, where were all these other habitats that used to be in our estuary, and can we get them back there? This is, and all just to increase our waterway health and productivity of our system, so we can continue to enjoy them.
Excellent, thank you. That's really interesting, because I think sometimes, particularly in the research, like we start so small, and as you said, we don't know what we don't know until we, and as we learn more, we learn that we don't know even more. So it's great to sort of think of that project in 10 years' time and see how it goes. So we've approached our time this evening. I would like to just start off by saying thank you so much to Troy, Brian, Charlotte, and Victoria for joining us this evening. It was great to hear from you all. I think that the science behind the management is really important part of what we're doing. So thank you all for joining us. It was really nice to have you all.